Hello and welcome to Inside Music Curation. We're the team at Feed Media Group. My name is Melissa Clark, and I've got my esteemed colleagues of our music curation team with me today to talk about 50 years of hip hop. We can't really pack 50 years of hip hop into 20 minutes, so we decided today we would dig in a little bit to our own personal experiences and hip hop's push into the mainstream. So again, I've got Claire, Sten, Juan, all master music curators here at Feed Media Group, where we program music for businesses. And wanted to just dive in. Stens, maybe tell us a little bit about the beginnings of hip hop, and then we'll switch over to talk about our personal experiences.
Yeah, well, I mean, I unfortunately wasn't there, so truth in advertising. But according to lore, in the summer of '73, at a block party in the Bronx, DJ Kool Herc, a Jamaican-influenced DJ, took a couple records and he started to loop them back and forth and extend the break, which is the juicy instrumental part that happens in a lot of mainstream popular songs, and he extended that break, hence the term break dancing. And that it really was a story of like innovative party hosting, right? And so that party ethos and the crowd involvement has always been part of the lifeblood of hip hop, among other things. And one other thing about hip hop that's always captivated me, well, two other, I can't resist. One, the kind of everything in the kitchen sink ism of the aesthetic is like there at the birth, right? It was like taking records and mixing and matching them in unusual ways with no copyright considerations, what at all, at all, because it was a live music form that originated fully 6 years before it was ever recorded. And then secondly, I think it's notable and so exciting that music is such a fundamental part of human experience, is that if you know give kids arts education and violins and pianos and singing lessons and stuff, they'll do that. And if you don't, and if you withhold arts education, like music is like a rose that grows up out of the concrete, like boom, it's powerful, like it is an innate need in humans. And so these incredible resourceful kids and young adults grabbed what they had available to them. They had records, they had record players, they had microphones, and from the musical limitations that they were presented and counted out, right, it spawned a whole new style of music that's overtaken the globe, right, that has so much uniqueness and relevance and currency, both socio-politically and also musically. The vibrancy of that, it's all there at the inception. And I think it's a story about race and racism. It's a story about America, and it's also a story about the power of music. Like, it cannot be supplanted, it cannot be kept down. Like, it's gonna come out, and it's awesome.
Well said, for sure. So it was all happening in the 70s and 80s, and I think we have the note here that in 1989, hip hop had established itself, and the Grammys introduced Best Rap Performance category. And we had an Inside Music Curation just a few weeks ago where we did a Grammys edition and talked about some of the changes there. And there's definitely still some work that could be done within the Grammy organization to address how this genre has evolved.
Yeah, and I'll just continue a little bit longer, just because I know I'm a little bit older than my curation colleagues, and a lot of this, as we were preparing, we realized that our relationship with hip hop, probably more so than other music forms, because it's of the moment, it's of the now. It's depended a lot on our age and our location. So I'm a little older, and so for me, my first introduction to hip hop, it was not 73, it was not 79 when Rapper's Delight put on Wax, right? I was way hella beyond that. And thanks God for Run DMC, Walk This Way, boom, it penetrated through to Iowa. I think I was in Iowa at the time. And it was like, I couldn't even make heads or tails of it, but I immediately loved it. And so to me, in my perspective, there were three big pushes to the mainstream, like power punches through the door of the mainstream. And the first was Run DMC's Walk This Way. The second was Dr. Dre's The Chronic in '92. And the third was Puff Daddy with the finishing stroke of No Way Out in '97, and the sad demise of Biggie. So, not to preempt what others have to say, but it's really a thing with hip hop of like, always that delicate balance between preserving the integrity of the art form while continuing to broaden it, which was both a conscious effort and I think a natural thing where when people got wind of it, they're like, I want to hear more of that, right? So it's like this delicate dance the whole time through hip hop history of like authentic versus pop and mainstream. So I'll piece out and let the others chime in. But to my mind, the first 30 years are really encapsulated by the early party music and the block parties, right? And the old school, which actually the old school predated Run DMC. It was disco influenced. So the disco influenced era into Run DMC and then Dr. Dre and boom, beyond.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think,
And
you know,
89 was Young MC, I think, right? Wasn't that Young MC in 89?
that sounds about right. I was also a young kid in the Midwest, and I remember Young MC. And, you know, it was when we talk about hip hop breaking through into mainstream, you got to talk about like what kids are listening to. And, you know, as like a 10, 11, 12 year old, you know, we were getting access to hip hop in a way that had never been done before, right? I mean, you had like Crisscross and Another Bad Creation that were literally like kids doing hip hop in a pop way that connected with a 10-year-old. And so that was a big deal. And then, you know, just really setting the tone for me, the Chronic was, you know, the game changer. And that's when everything changed.
Yeah, being a 90s baby was interesting. Because it was like you were born into it, right? Like I didn't know that rap didn't exist before, right? And as a child, it was like, besides the content, which my parents were very strict, I wasn't really able to listen or buy rap, right? Until I was like maybe 10 or 11. But that being said, it wasn't that I could not hear it, right? It was on every street corner in Hartford. It was in every barber shop. It was at every pizza stop. If you were playing baseball in the 90s, you were listening to rap. Like it was inescapable. And then as far as being a kid in the 90s, like one of my favorite pastimes was, being at the lunch table with the guys or with, the ladies as well, right? And we're just hitting the table, slapping beats. And if we're outside and we have no tables, we're beatboxing, right? And it just, the lexicon of that, and actually there are plenty inappropriate stories I have in college where we're also beatboxing and doing stuff like that. But at the same time, like it's a pastime that is shared both professionally, amateur. It's a culture. It's a integral part of American culture.
Yeah, definitely. I had sort of some interesting reflections and thinking back of, being now, consider myself a hip hop fan of, more certain artists or genres than like or subgenres versus like an entire one, but in a sort of similar like 90s timeline, thinking back to what an early memory of being exposed to hip hop was. One thing that did come up is I do distinctly remember in the sort of like pop radio crossover, having to change the radio channel if it was a rap song with my parents, of like that was not gonna fly in that respect. So, and I hadn't thought about that memory in a long time, but I'd also, in terms of, yeah, like, well, I'd never like bought a specifically like rap or hip hop CD. I did have the first two Now CDs, and on there the Jay-Z Hard Knock Life was on one of them, which obviously uses a song from Annie, and which sort of has, at 8 years old, had plenty of sort of like appeal of like it was a sample I already knew. And you don't have a ton of musical knowledge at that age, but was sort of thinking about that as like an interesting sort of gateway into it. And additionally, around that same time, Nelly's Country Grammar also sort of used that like playground chant, the like down down baby thing, and like which was also familiar to kids. So I thought that was an interesting like sort of thing to pinpoint of like, okay, yeah, like it's really like not just targeting specific areas or audiences, like this is ready to move into the pop mainstream.
Claire, you
Yeah,
sparked
and
memory. Oops, go ahead.
I just got it really quick and then come to your memory, but like that playground, that kid dimension to it, right? And that element of how hip hop has always been, in some respects, super accessible and in some other respects, inaccessible, right? In terms of the content. But on the accessible end of the spectrum, sorry, I adore Run DMC, is like some of their early songs, like Here We Go, or some of them, they literally are like a Dr. Seuss, book, for better or for worse, right? And it's like, but it's authentic. It's like, and Method Man will always grab like catchphrases from everywhere in the world, and like nothing is sacred, nothing's off limits. Like there's a playfulness to hip hop that will like
That's what
take
I was gonna say too. Yeah.
literally anything into it, right, and like repurpose it for its own usage.
Mhm.
But on to Juan's memory.
Yeah, let's hear it.
So I originally thought that the first hip hop CD I got was Will Smith, Big Willie style. But you actually helped me unlock something. My first technically rap CD was Space Jam.
Yeah.
And like the Monstars, like all that whole thing. Like now that I'm thinking about it, that's the first time I heard LL Cool J. That was, I think Redman was on that too. Like I have to like revisit it, but yeah, like it is a very interesting thing.
Totally.
Video, right? I mean, video was another way that you got introduced to hip hop, whether it was through a movie like Space Jam or the Judgment Night soundtrack, or I mean, there's so many of these. And then MTV, obviously, MTV in the 90s, same timing, about when The Chronic came out. Look at all of the videos that came out of that West, like that. Those are ingrained in my memory. I remember the look and the style and the vibe. That's a real standout kind of MTV hip hop moment for me.
Yeah, and I mean, Chuck D famously has said that, hip hop is the CNN for Black America, right? And so, which is so, it's like profound and it's true. Like so much underrepresentation was made visible, right, and given a loudspeaker and given a platform, and the visual component, right, it only augmented that and broadened it and gave people more perspective on it, and sometimes in ways that weren't maybe true to life, like Dr. Dre videos, but it was also capturing a slice of American life that was totally foreign to a lot of people, like the inherent foreign, there's so many dimensions, sorry, the inherent foreignness and the rebelliousness that's built into rap was the very thing that drew people that are clearly outsiders like myself to it. It's like that foreignness is appealing and interesting, right? Like the same way that Elvis Presley was foreign and appealing and interesting and dangerous. Like there's an appealingness to that, of wanting to understand and somehow witness and have a flavor of that.
Yeah, and Eric just posted a comment as well, talking about the crossover designation being applied to race, and that there's also the socioeconomic side of it. And again, too, like for us, we're trying to hone in on these like breakthrough moments where like, and it really just depends on when you were coming up, right? Like for me as an 80s kid, kind of coming into my own in the 90s, like where I was first hearing that. And certainly there was there was a lot of that happening before, like the message here that was noted by Eric.
Tell me where you feel like, I've been so candid of how I feel like the punch points for hip hop punching through the mainstream were. What's your take on it, Juan? I mean, I'm curious in both of yours, but Juan, I know you're also a dedicated hip hop listener and student, so
Yeah, I
you
mean,
know.
so my main experience is mostly in the 90s, right? So Biggie and Tupac passing was something that I was in 6th grade at the time. Their music wasn't something that I was less necessarily listening to, right? I wasn't necessarily allowed to, but the the story behind it, the media presence behind it, it made it inescapable. So from 6th grade, I knew who Tupac and Biggie was. I could recognize some of the songs from the radio necessarily, but I would say that like put hip hop on a platform where it was being talked about more. When you think about the music that really breaks through like boundaries. It's always the music that is talked about the most. When rock was doing its thing back in the 40s and 50s, it scared a lot of people. And it made it something that was topical, and people talked about it until, wow, now we're looking at rock and roll like what, 80 years after, and we're like, wow, look at the diaspora of different like flavors we have of that, right? So to that point, yeah, that was a super important time. And then literally the late 90s, early aughts, implementing that very pop and almost EDM quality, right? Like will.i.am with like Black Eyed Peas, adding that EDM thing, and also Puffy, not necessarily at the same time, but almost kind of like feeding into it with all of the remixes, right? Making things that were dancey and fun again. That really changed the trajectory of where in the late 90s, you had things like DMX, you had Jay-Z, you had Ja Rule, and it was all kind of tough. They were all necessarily tough, and you were starting to see the softening of it, which I think is what necessarily made it from something that was urban, which I don't necessarily agree with that term, but something that it was just global, and I guess you could say suburban, right? Something that, your mom can listen to Pitbull and she's just like, yeah, I love Pitbull and I love Flo Rida, right? Maybe she's not a huge fan of, the Baby or, Gunna or something like that. But I think that's really where the breaking point is that the early aughts of how this music just became so explosive. And I'll stop talking now. Sorry.
No, I agree. I actually, in prepping for this, reviewed Spotify's playlist. They have the I love my like 90s hip hop and I love my 2000s hip hop. Just for like cultural reference of like, I wanted to see, how many songs I recognized of the 90s and how much of the 2000s. And part of that is age, of course. But the other part, like stylistically, you can really see the crossover nature, having more collaborations in the 2000s, having that like there would be like there's more melodic and more like sung choruses or elements like that I think contribute to the radio friendliness and like the pop movement side of it as well. So I thought that was really interesting.
Yeah, sorry, about the sung choruses and things like that is such an astute observation, because there is such a correlation, I feel like, between the sung choruses and the melodic qualities and the poppiness of it, where, it used to be laughable or highly unusual for a rapper to ever sing like Biz Markie or whatever, or in the case of Ghostface, he's singing off key because it's like, I don't give a shit. But, with, sorry, it's a hip hop show. I cussed.
Yeah.
Anyways, but, then you have rappers like 50 where his choruses and stuff, like, is he singing? Well, not literally, but there's a cadence to it, right? Where it's got a very lyrical quality, exactly what you said. And like Eminem, I actually don't like the way Eminem sings. It really grates on me, but he made a normal thing with his hits starting in the early 2000s of he would sing in octaves for his choruses, right? And like there's that melodic dimension. And so whereas, hip hop in its quote pure or raw or original form was like, the absence of melody, which was often used against it, like it can't be music. And I'm seriously, because it prioritizes rhythm as opposed to prioritizing harmony, or excuse me, melody. But then you get this melodic push, which also, and Black Eyed Peas are a perfect example, right? Like they embedded melody into their hip hop songs they were probably the fourth punch into the mainstream, to be honest.
Yeah. They were a gigantic, they were a big push. I mean, to that time, there wasn't really anything like Black Eyed Peas, where it was fully encapsulating the pop nature of it with Fergie, and then bringing in the element of hip hop, but then the rhythmic bass was more EDM than hip hop, but skirting that line. It was just like one of those things where at the turn of 2000, like, wow, that's a refreshing sound to listen to. But back to Claire's points about the collaborations, right? There's something about the lineage from Mary J. Blige, Method Man's 911, right? All the way down to like, Ashanti and Ja Rule. Like, geez, Ja Rule actually owned that whole thing. He did even like, what do you call it? J-Lo, But the one record that I felt was just like something that was kind of like, wow, this is interesting. And this is the turn, was Ghetto Superstar. I don't know if you guys were familiar with that song, how that song exploded. ODB wasn't necessarily a family-friendly rapper, right? And
Really?
yeah, and Praz wasn't necessarily a rapper that was at the esteem of Wyclef, right? Where it was more of a household name. So to have that track go as hard as it did with Maya, which much respect to Maya, but Maya out of the Brandy, the Monica, and all of those like R&B stars was the lesser known. But to have that hit at around the same time as, Claire was saying with the, Jay-Z's Hard Knock Life, that all that stuff was really pushing hip hop further into the pop sphere.
Yeah, and
that accessibility along the sampling, and yeah, it just goes a long way.
And what you see is this, tidal wave where the pop driven hip hop, it like rises all tides, if you will, where now in the 2010s, you saw not only pop oriented hip hop starting to penetrate massively on the pop charts or the Billboard, Hot 100 charts. You see like straight up hip hop acts like the Baby, like it really took, honestly, for better or for worse. And there could be some naysayers that were like, I don't ever want to hear a hip hop song with a chorus. But like, I think the true hip hop fans recognize that these, pop hip hop artists, right, that they helped to move it forward, right? And that the other more like hardcore rappers or those that were more in the older vein, right? Like it gave them a bigger platform too.
Yeah. Well, like I said, it's tough to talk about 50. Oh, go for it, one. Go for it.
I will say though, the thing about hip hop that I love so much is that one doesn't exist without the other. You need the underground in order to influence that pop. And I'm not going to go down this rabbit hole. I could, but trap is the literal answer to that. It's a form of hip hop that, had trap or drill or any of those. They have a very gritty past from not that long ago, but utilizing that, changing that aspect, giving it into a popular view, not only highlights those players that are, like Chief Keef, all those guys are, speaking from the CNN from the street, right? But then you're having these other people that are talking about a whole other different lexicon of things from like, Megan Thee Stallion or, Sweetie, So it's one of those things. It's so important that the two of them exist. And that's why this genre is so dynamic. And now I'll stop talking.
And it's overflowed and it's musically enriched, like it's watered plants that are way outside of the hip hop space. I mean, what you just said is it's become the water that wells up, or the musical bad metaphor, but it like overflows way beyond, right? Where now we have what we call post-genre pop, where it's like the different, dimensions of certain genres or styles are so much cross-pollinated. And one of the biggest cross-pollinators in pop music for the last 20 years, it's inarguable that hip-hop's been one of the biggest to cross, to flourish these new styles and elements, right? Much more. I mean, what you said, Juan, is completely on point.
I'd also say it's an interesting context too, in comparison with country, of like there's less debate, I think, or a little bit more like welcomeness of like, sure, that can be hip hop now. Whereas like the conversation in country keeps coming back to like, well, is that country or not? And hip hop kind of just like lets it happen and grow, and like is less trying to define itself so rigidly. And I think like that's what allows the creativity and stuff to flourish as well.
Well said.
Come a long way from 2 turntables and a microphone, you know?
Mhm.
Big time.
Well said. Well, I don't think I could end it any better than that. But again, I will say it's tough to talk about 50 years of hip hop in 20 minutes. So please stay tuned. Again, we're the team at Feed Media Group and spend most of our time curating music for business purposes. And we talk all things music curation here on Inside Music Curation. We're back the first Wednesday of every month, and we do plan a couple more celebratory 50 years of hip hop nods throughout the summer. So stay tuned. We hope to see you back here and talk a little bit more about hip hop and other things in music. Thanks, guys.
Thank
Man.
you.